Millionaire impregnates young maid working in his mansion. He decides to fire her to maintain his clean image. 5 years later, everyone was stunned by the young woman's outcome. The ex-maid now showed the power of a determined woman. The sun had barely risen when Emily opened her eyes, awakened by the shrill sound of the alarm clock. With a tired sigh, she got up from the narrow bed, her feet touching the cold floor of the small room she shared with her 2 younger sisters. The cramped apartment in the suburbs of Chicago was home to the 22-year-old, her sick mother, and her 3 younger siblings. Emily dressed quickly, trying not to make noise to avoid waking her sisters who were still sleeping. She observed her mother's pale face resting on the living room sofa bed before leaving to catch the first bus of the day. The journey to the mansion where she worked was long, but Emily took advantage of this time to plan her day and dream of a better future. Upon arriving at the imposing residence in the city's most upscale neighborhood, Emily felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Her job as a domestic worker was the family's only source of income, and she couldn't afford to make mistakes. With determination, she entered through the back door, put on her uniform, and began her workday. The mansion was a world apart, with its endless corridors, sumptuous rooms, and an absurd amount of expensive objects that Emily had to clean with extreme care. The owners of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, were absent figures, always traveling on business or attending social events. The one who really ran the house was the couple's son, Richard Thompson, a man in his 40s, known for his difficult temperament and impossible demands. That morning, as Emily cleaned Richard's office, she couldn't help but notice the framed photos on the walls. Images of Richard at luxurious parties, alongside celebrities and important politicians. It was a world so distant from hers that it seemed to belong to another planet. "Emily," Richard's deep voice surprised her, making her turn quickly. "I need you to organize the documents on my desk, and don't touch anything you shouldn't, understood?" "Yes, sir," Emily replied, lowering her eyes. She felt Richard's gaze running over her body, and an unpleasant shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't the first time she had noticed the way he observed her, and it left her deeply uncomfortable. While organizing the papers, Emily couldn't help but notice some documents that seemed important. Astronomical numbers and names of famous companies jumped out at her. She quickly averted her gaze, remembering Richard's warning. The day went on as usual, with Emily running from one side of the mansion to the other, cleaning, tidying up, and attending to the whims of her employers. It was already late afternoon when she finally had a moment of rest in the kitchen. "Emily, dear, you look exhausted," said Mrs. Johnson, the house cook, an elderly lady who treated Emily like a daughter. "Have some coffee and rest for a bit." Emily smiled gratefully, accepting the steaming cup. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I don't know what I'd do without you here." The two chatted for a few minutes, with Mrs. Johnson telling the latest gossip from the neighborhood where she lived. Emily laughed at the lady's stories, feeling momentarily relieved of the weight of her responsibilities. The moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Richard entered the kitchen, his gaze fixed on Emily. "Emily, I need you to come to my office now. I have a special job for you," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. Something in Richard's voice put her on alert. She exchanged a worried look with Mrs. Johnson before following her employer through the mansion's corridors. In the office, Richard closed the door behind them. Emily stood still, tense, waiting for instructions. "Emily, you know you're a very important employee for this house, don't you?" Richard began, slowly approaching. "Thank you, sir," Emily replied, instinctively taking a step back. "I've been observing you," he continued, ignoring the young woman's evident discomfort, "and I think it's time we deepened our relationship." Emily's heart raced. She knew she was in danger, but she also knew she couldn't simply run away. Her job, her family's livelihood, depended on this man. "Sir, I think there's a misunderstanding," she stammered, looking for a way out. Richard laughed, a cold sound that made Emily shiver. "There's no misunderstanding at all, dear. You know very well what's happening here." He advanced, cornering Emily against the wall. His eyes shone with a mixture of desire and cruelty that terrified the young woman. "Please don't," Emily begged, tears starting to form in her eyes. But Richard wasn't willing to listen. His hands gripped Emily's arms tightly, and she felt her world crumbling around her. At that moment, as she struggled against the inevitable, Emily thought of her family, her sick mother, her siblings who depended on her. She thought of the injustice of the world that allowed men like Richard to have so much power over people like her. And amid the terror and powerlessness, something inside Emily hardened. A fierce determination was born in her heart. She vowed to herself that somehow she would find a way to overcome this, to get revenge, to change things. But at that moment, all she could do was survive. The days following the incident in Richard's office were a blur of anguish and fear for Emily. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, mechanically fulfilling her tasks, avoiding glances, and trying to make herself invisible. Every time she heard Richard's footsteps, her entire body tensed, ready to flee. On a particularly difficult morning, when the simple act of getting out of bed seemed like a Herculean task, Emily was surprised by a wave of nausea so strong that she barely made it to the bathroom in time. As she leaned on the sink, looking at her pale reflection in the mirror, a terrible realization began to take shape in her mind. "No, it can't be," she muttered to herself, her hands trembling. But as the days passed and the symptoms persisted, Emily could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. The discovery hit her like a punch to the stomach. Emily felt herself sinking into a well of despair, the implications of her situation weighing on her like a ton of bricks. How could she care for a baby? How would she explain this to her family? And more importantly, how would she face Richard? It was in this moment of deep distress that Emily found an unexpected ally. Sophia, one of the other maids in the mansion, noticed Emily's disturbed state and approached her gently during a break. "Emily, what's going on? You haven't seemed well for days," Sophia asked, her voice full of genuine concern. Something in Sophia's compassionate expression made Emily's defenses crumble. Before she could contain herself, she was telling everything: the harassment, the assault, the pregnancy. The words came out in a torrent, interspersed with sobs. Sophia listened in silence, her face a mixture of shock and anger. When Emily finished, she held her friend's hands firmly. "Emily, you're not alone in this. Saisa, I went through something similar with Richard." Sophia's revelation was like an electric shock to Emily. You too?" Sophia nodded, tears in her eyes. "It was 2 years ago. I was so scared, so ashamed, I didn't tell anyone. But now seeing what happened to you, I know I can't stay silent anymore." The two women hugged, united by a shared pain and a sudden understanding that they weren't alone. At that moment, something changed in Emily. The feeling of powerlessness began to give way to a burning anger, a determination not to let Richard get away with it. "We need to do something," Emily said, wiping away her tears. "We can't let him keep doing this to other women." Sophia agreed, but her face was tense with worry. "But how? He's powerful, he has connections. Who would believe us?" Emily was silent for a moment, thinking. Then an idea began to form in her mind. What if it's not just the two of us? What if there are other victims? If we could gather more women, maybe we'd have a chance. The idea was scary but also exciting. It was the first time in weeks that Emily had felt something beyond fear and despair. It was a spark of hope. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Sophia began to work discreetly, sounding out other employees past and present of the Thompson mansion. What they discovered was shocking. Richard had left a trail of trauma and fear wherever he went. Women who had worked in the mansion years before still carried the emotional scars of their encounters with him. Slowly, a group began to form. Women who had kept their secrets for years finally found a space to share their stories. Each new revelation strengthened Emily's determination. She knew she was carrying not only her own burden, but the hopes of all these women. However, as the group grew, so did the risk of being discovered. Emily knew they were playing with fire. If Richard found out what they were doing, the consequences would be devastating. It was during this tense period that Emily met Amanda, a newly graduated lawyer who worked in a small office near the mansion. The encounter was by chance. Emily was distributing pamphlets about workers' rights on her day off when Amanda approached her, interested in the material. The two began to talk, and Emily, driven by a courage she didn't know she possessed, shared a bit about her situation. Amanda listened attentively, her eyes shining with a mixture of compassion and indignation. "What's happening to you and these other women is illegal and morally repugnant," Amanda said, her voice firm. "You have rights, and I want to help you fight for those rights." Amanda's offer was like a ray of light, piercing the dark clouds that had accumulated over Emily's life. For the first time, she glimpsed a real path to justice. However, the road ahead was far from easy. While Emily and the other women worked with Amanda to build their case, Richard began to suspect that something was happening. He became more paranoid, more controlling. The atmosphere in the mansion became even tenser, with Emily constantly looking over her shoulder, fearing discovery. The situation came to a head when Richard summoned Emily to his office again. Her heart raced, vividly remembering the last time she was there. But this time she wasn't defenseless. She had a group of strong women by her side and a plan in progress. "Emily, I've noticed some changes in you lately," Richard began, his cold eyes fixed on her. "I hope you're not doing anything stupid." Emily met his gaze, fighting against the fear that threatened to engulf her. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," she responded, her voice firmer than she felt. Richard stood up, rounding the desk to face her. "Don't play with me, Emily. You know very well that I have enough power to make your life a living hell. Think about your family, your job." The threat hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Emily felt her heart race, but something inside her refused to bow. She thought of all the women who had trusted her, of Amanda who was risking her career to help them, of her unborn child who deserved a better world. "I'm not afraid of you," Emily said, the words coming out before she could think. "Not anymore." Richard's expression contorted into a mask of fury. He advanced, grabbing Emily's arm forcefully. "You'll regret this, you ungrateful bitch." At that moment, the office door opened. Sophia was there, her cell phone in hand, clearly recording the scene. Behind her, other maids crowded, silent witnesses to Richard's true nature. Richard's face paled as he saw the crowd. He immediately released Emily, stammering for an explanation, but it was too late. The wall of silence and fear he had built around himself was crumbling. Emily left the office with her head held high, surrounded by a protective circle of women who, like her, had decided it was time to fight. The battle was far from over, but at that moment, for the first time, Emily felt they had a real chance of winning. As she left the mansion that night, Emily looked up at the starry Chicago sky. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and dangers, but she was no longer alone. And with this newfound strength, she was ready to face whatever came her way. Dawn brought with it a mixture of apprehension and determination for Emily. The events of the previous night still echoed in her mind. The confrontation with Richard, Sophia's intervention, the sensation of power that arose from being surrounded by her allies. But now, in the light of day, the consequences of her actions were beginning to manifest. Upon arriving at the Thompson mansion, Emily was immediately called to the housekeeper's office, Mrs. Parker, a stern woman who ran the house with an iron fist. "Emily, I'm afraid I have bad news," Mrs. Parker began, her tone cold and professional. "Due to recent events, your presence is no longer required in this residence. You are dismissed, effective immediately." Despite having anticipated this possibility, the words still hit Emily like a physical blow. Her job, her family's source of livelihood, had disappeared in an instant. But what about my rights, my notice period?" Emily stammered, struggling to maintain her composure. Mrs. Parker pushed an envelope across the desk. "Here's your severance. Mr. Thompson was generous considering the circumstances. I suggest you accept it and leave peacefully." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing the veiled threat in the housekeeper's words. She left the mansion feeling stunned, carrying a box with her few belongings. Outside the gates, she found Sophia waiting for her. "I figured this would happen," Sophia said, hugging her friend. "Don't worry, we'll figure something out." The two walked together to a nearby cafe, where Amanda, the young lawyer, was waiting for them. Amanda's face contorted with concern when she saw Emily's dejected expression. "They fired you, didn't they?" Amanda asked, although she already knew the answer. Emily nodded silently, handing the envelope with her severance to the lawyer to examine. Amanda frowned as she read the documents. "This is clearly retaliation. We can use this to our advantage in the lawsuit." Lawsuit? Emily asked, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. I don't know if I can afford a lawsuit, Amanda. I just lost my job. My family depends on me. Amanda placed a comforting hand on Emily's. I understand your concern, Emily, but that's exactly why we need to fight. It's not just about you now, it's about all the women who have gone through and may still go through what you went through. Sophia nodded emphatically. Besides, we're not alone in this. Several of the other girls who worked at the mansion are willing to testify. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a growing determination. You're right. We can't let Richard continue doing this. In the weeks that followed, Emily found herself on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, there was the anguish of being unemployed, worries about her pregnancy and fear of the future. On the other, there was a growing sense of purpose and unity as more and more women joined their cause. Amanda worked tirelessly, preparing the lawsuit against Richard and the Thompson family. She spent hours interviewing victims, collecting evidence, and building a solid case. Emily was impressed by the young lawyer's dedication, who often worked until late at night, driven by a sense of justice that seemed tireless. Meanwhile, Emily faced her own challenges. Telling her family about her pregnancy and job loss was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do. Her mother, already fragile from illness, cried silently upon hearing the news. Her younger siblings, though not fully understanding the situation, sensed the gravity in the air. "What are we going to do now, Emily?" her youngest sister asked, eyes wide with concern. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. "We'll be okay," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'll figure something out." And she really tried. With Sophia's help, Emily managed to get a temporary job at a small coffee shop downtown. The salary was considerably less than what she earned at the Thompson mansion, but it was something. In between shifts, she met with Amanda and the other women, preparing for the legal battle that was to come. It was during this period that Emily met Jake, a lawyer who worked in the same building as Amanda. He frequented the coffee shop regularly and gradually began to notice the pregnant young woman, who served him with a tired but determined smile. One day, when the coffee shop was almost empty, Jake approached the counter where Emily was. "Excuse the intrusion," he began hesitantly, "but I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be going through a tough time. Is there anything I can help with?" Emily was surprised by the offer. She was used to fighting her own battles, to not easily trusting others, especially men, but there was something in Jake's sincere expression that made her lower her guard a little. "It's a long story," she replied, a small smile forming on her lips. Jake looked at his watch and then back at Emily. "Well, my next appointment was cancelled. If you want to talk, I have time." At that moment, something changed for Emily. Maybe it was the accumulated fatigue of the past few months, or maybe it was simply the need to share her burden with someone new. Regardless of the reason, she found herself telling her story to Jake. To her surprise, Jake listened with attention and compassion. When she finished, he seemed genuinely moved and outraged by what she had gone through. "Emily, what happened to you is terrible and completely illegal," Jake said, his voice full of conviction. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to help with your case. I have experience in labor law and I think I can add to Amanda's team." The offer caught Emily off guard. "But why? You don't even know me." Jake smiled gently. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I believe that your courage in facing this situation can make a difference not just for you, but for many other women." That night, when Emily met with Amanda and the other women, she brought Jake with her. Initially, there was some hesitation in the group. After all, trusting a man after everything they had been through wasn't easy. But as Jake explained how he could help, offering his knowledge and resources pro bono, the atmosphere began to change. Amanda, in particular, was excited about the prospect of having an experienced ally. "With Jake on board, our chances increase considerably," she said, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. As the night progressed and plans were discussed, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Looking around the room, at the diverse group of women united by a common cause, at Amanda with her tireless determination, and at Jake, an unexpected ally, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could actually win this battle. When the meeting ended and everyone started to say goodbye, Jake approached Emily. "You're an amazing woman, Emily," he said softly. "What you're doing, facing all this. It's really inspiring." Emily felt her cheeks flush slightly at the compliment. "Thank you, Jake, and thank you for joining us in this fight." As she walked home that night, Emily placed her hand on her growing belly. For the first time since discovering the pregnancy, she felt not just fear and uncertainty, but also a spark of optimism for the future. It wouldn't be easy, she knew that. The battle against Richard and the Thompsons would be long and difficult, but now with this group of allies by her side, Emily felt she had a real chance to fight not just for herself, but for all the women who had been silenced for so long. With this new determination, Emily entered her small apartment, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The fight was just beginning, but she was no longer alone. The following months brought a series of challenges and changes for Emily. Her belly grew each day, a constant reminder of the life to come and the battle she faced. The work at the coffee shop, though tiring, provided a welcome routine and a sense of normalcy amid the chaos of her life. Meanwhile, the case against Richard Thompson was gaining strength. Amanda and Jake worked tirelessly, building a solid defense based on the women's testimonies and the evidence they had managed to gather. Emily was surprised by the complexity of the legal process, the countless motions, hearings, and paperwork that seemed to multiply each week. One particularly busy afternoon at the coffee shop, Emily was balancing a tray full of cups when she felt a sudden dizziness. She stumbled, almost dropping everything, when she felt a pair of firm hands holding her. "Careful," said a familiar voice. It was Jake who had entered the coffee shop without her noticing. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, regaining her balance. "Yes, just a little dizzy." "Thank you." Jake observed her with concern. "Emily, don't you think you're pushing yourself too hard? At this stage of pregnancy, you should be resting more." She sighed, placing the tray on a nearby table. "I know, but I don't have a choice. I need this job." Jake hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've been thinking, my office needs an administrative assistant. The work is less physically demanding and the pay is better. Would you be interested?" Emily stared at him, surprised. You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering an opportunity," Jake replied with a gentle smile. "You're intelligent, dedicated, and deserve something better than this. Besides, you'd be closer to the case development." The offer was tempting, but Emily hesitated. I don't know if I have the necessary qualifications." "You have something more important than any formal qualification: determination," Jake said. "The rest you can learn. Think about it, okay?" That night, Emily discussed the proposal with her family. Her mother, though worried about the change, saw the opportunity as a blessing. "Daughter, you deserve this," she said, squeezing Emily's hand. "And this baby deserves a better chance." After much reflection, Emily accepted Jake's offer. Her last day at the coffee shop was bittersweet. She had made friends there, found a refuge amid the storm of her life. But the future was calling, and she knew she needed to move forward. The new job at the law office brought its own challenges. Emily found herself immersed in a world of legal terms, deadlines, and procedures that initially seemed overwhelming. But she was determined to learn, to prove her worth. Jake proved to be a patient and understanding boss, always available to explain complex concepts or offer guidance. Emily couldn't help but notice the way he treated her, with respect, consideration, and even a certain admiration that made her blush at times. One afternoon, while organizing some files, Emily overheard a heated discussion coming from Jake's office. Curious, she approached the half-open door. "You don't understand, Jake." It was Amanda's voice, tense and frustrated. "The Thompsons are playing dirty. They're trying to intimidate our witnesses, spreading rumors, using all their influence to suppress the case." "I know, Amanda," Jake replied, his voice tired but determined. "But we can't give up. We have to find a way around this." Emily felt her heart tighten. She knew the battle would be difficult, but hearing the extent of the obstacles they faced was disheartening. That night, unable to sleep, Emily was leafing through some of the case files she had brought home. Among the documents, she found something that caught her attention: a financial report from the Thompson Company that seemed to contain discrepancies. Excited by the discovery, Emily called Amanda, not caring about the late hour. "Amanda, I think I found something," she said as soon as the lawyer answered. "There are irregularities in the Thompsons' financial reports. Could this be useful for our case?" On the other end of the line, Amanda was silent for a moment. "Emily, this could be exactly what we needed," she finally said, her voice laden with renewed hope. "Good job." In the days that followed, the team worked frenetically to investigate the Thompsons' finances further. What they discovered was shocking, an elaborate scheme of tax fraud and money laundering that had been going on for years. "This changes everything," Jake said during a team meeting. "Now we have real leverage against them." Emily watched as Amanda and Jake discussed strategies, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had contributed significantly to the case, but she also knew that things were about to get much more complicated. As the case gained momentum, Emily began to receive veiled threats. Phone calls in the middle of the night, strange people watching her on the street. The fear she thought she had overcome began to resurface. One night, as she was walking home after work, Emily noticed a car following her slowly. Her heart raced and she quickened her pace, one hand protectively over her belly. As she turned a corner, she almost collided with Jake, who apparently had been waiting for her. "Emily, is everything okay?" he asked, noticing her panic. She quickly explained about the suspicious car. Jake immediately took her to a nearby cafe, his arm protectively around her. "This can't continue," he said, his voice laden with concern and a touch of anger. "I'm going to hire security for you. We can't risk your safety or the baby's." Sitting there in the cozy cafe with Jake by her side, Emily felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Gratitude for the protection and support, fear of what was to come, but also a growing admiration for this man who had become much more than a boss or ally. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." He gently interrupted her, taking her hands in his. "Emily, you don't need to thank me. What you're doing, the courage you show every day, it's inspiring. I care a lot about you." Emily's eyes widened at the implicit confession. She felt her heart race, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something she didn't expect to feel again so soon. At that moment, looking into Jake's eyes, Emily felt a spark of hope for the future. Not just for the case, not just for justice, but for something more personal, deeper. But before she could explore these feelings, Jake's cell phone rang, bringing them back to reality. It was Amanda, with urgent news about the case. As Jake answered the call, Emily looked out the cafe window, observing the night city. She knew the battle was far from over. The Thompsons were still powerful, dangerous. The path ahead would be difficult and full of obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly hopeful. With allies like Amanda and Jake by her side, with the strength she had discovered within herself, she was ready to face whatever came her way. Placing her hand on her belly, Emily made a silent promise to her unborn child. She would fight not just for justice for herself and for the other women who had suffered, but for a better future, a world where no one would have to go through what she went through. With this renewed resolution, Emily prepared for the next chapter of her struggle, knowing that no matter what happened, she was no longer alone. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Emily woke up, feeling the first movements of the baby in her womb. She smiled, placing her hand on her now very visible belly. It was moments like these that reminded her why she was fighting so hard. The weeks since the discovery of the Thompsons' financial irregularities had been intense. The law office had transformed into a veritable battlefield, with Amanda and Jake working tirelessly to build a solid case. Emily, for her part, had immersed herself in her new role, absorbing legal knowledge at a speed that surprised everyone. That morning, as she prepared for another day of work, Emily reflected on how her life had changed. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows, but now it was accompanied by a fierce determination and a growing confidence in her own abilities. Arriving at the office, Emily was greeted by an atmosphere of agitation. Amanda was on the phone, her expression a mixture of frustration and determination. Jake, on the other hand, was hunched over a pile of documents, his brows furrowed in concentration. "What's going on?" Emily asked, feeling the tension in the air. Jake looked up, a tired smile on his lips. "The Thompsons have counterattacked. They're trying to discredit our witnesses and bury the financial evidence we found. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. Can they do that? They have money and influence, Amanda replied, hanging up the phone. But we have the truth on our side. And now, thanks to you, Emily, we have something more. Amanda approached, holding a file. Remember those financial irregularities you found? Well, they led us to something much bigger. We've discovered that the Thompsons are involved in a corruption scheme that even reaches some influential politicians. Emily's eyes widened at the revelation. That's huge. Jake nodded, his expression serious. That's why they're fighting so hard. It's not just about the harassment now. It's about their entire empire that's at risk of crumbling. The weight of the situation fell on Emily. She had started this journey seeking justice for herself and for the other women who had suffered at Richard's hands. Now, unwittingly, she found herself at the center of something much larger, something that could have ramifications throughout society. What do we do now? She asked, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Amanda smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. Now, we fight, with everything we've got. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. The case gained media attention, with journalists surrounding the office in search of statements. Emily found herself at the center of a media storm, her face plastered across newspapers and newscasts. The pressure was immense. Emily received messages of support from strangers who had heard her story, but she also faced the cruel scrutiny of tabloids trying to discredit her. There were moments when she wondered if it was all worth it, if it wouldn't be better to simply give up and try to move on with her life. It was on one of these difficult nights that Jake found her crying in the office, late at night. "Emily," he said softly, sitting down beside her, "you don't have to carry all this weight alone." She looked up, tears running down her cheeks. "Sometimes I feel like all of this is too much. What if we fail? What if after everything they still get away with it?" Jake took her hands in his touch gentle and comforting. "Emily, look at me. You've already won. Your courage has inspired dozens of other women to speak up. You've brought to light crimes that were hidden for years. No matter the final outcome in court, you've already changed lives." Jake's words touched something deep inside Emily. She looked at him, seeing not just a dedicated lawyer or an understanding boss, but a man who truly cared about her, who believed in her when she herself doubted. At that moment, driven by emotion and gratitude, Emily leaned in and kissed Jake. It was a soft kiss, hesitant at first, but soon deepened, laden with all the unspoken feelings that had grown between them over the past few months. When they finally parted, both were silent for a moment, processing what had just happened. I'm sorry," Emily began, but Jake gently interrupted her. "Don't be," he said, a warm smile on his lips. "I've been wanting to do that for a long time." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Jake's phone ringing. It was Amanda, with urgent news. One of the main figures involved in the Thompsons' corruption scheme had decided to cooperate with the investigation, offering crucial information in exchange for a plea bargain. The news was like an adrenaline injection. Suddenly, the victory that seemed so distant was within reach. Emily felt a wave of renewed determination wash over her. In the days that followed, the team worked tirelessly, preparing for what promised to be a historic trial. Emily, now more confident than ever, took an active role in the preparation. Her unique perspective as a victim and now legal assistant proving invaluable. As the day of the trial approached, the tension in the air was palpable. The Thompsons, sensing they were losing ground, resorted to increasingly desperate tactics. There were attempts at bribery, veiled threats, and even a mysterious car accident that nearly injured Amanda. But none of this shook the team's determination. If anything, each obstacle only strengthened their resolve. On the eve of the trial, Emily was at home, mentally preparing herself for what was to come. Her phone rang. It was Sophia, her former colleague from the Thompson mansion. "Emily!" Sophia's voice was choked with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you. For all of us. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already given us something we thought we had lost forever. Hope." Sophia's words touched Emily deeply. She looked at her belly, now very prominent, and smiled. Tomorrow, she would face Richard Thompson and his family in court. It would be difficult, painful even, but she was ready. Because now Emily understood that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about all the Sophias, all the women who had been silenced, all the victims who never had a chance to seek justice. And it was about the future of her child, and of all children who deserve to grow up in a fairer world. With that understanding, Emily lay down, a protective hand on her belly. Tomorrow would be a new day, the beginning of a new battle. But for the first time in a long time, when Emily closed her eyes, it wasn't nightmares that awaited her, but dreams of a bright future full of possibilities. The Chicago County Courthouse was surrounded by an agitated crowd that morning. Journalists jostled each other, cameras in hand, while protesters raised signs demanding justice. Emily observed everything from the car window, her heart beating rapidly. "Are you ready?" Jake asked softly, holding her hand. Emily took a deep breath, seeking strength. "I am," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. As she got out of the car, Emily was immediately engulfed by a wave of flashes and shouts from reporters. Amanda and Jake flanked her, forming a protective barrier as they guided her into the building. In the courthouse lobby, Emily saw familiar faces, Sophia and other ex-employees of the Thompson mansion, all there to testify and support. Their encouraging looks gave Emily an additional injection of courage. When the courtroom doors opened, Emily felt as if she were entering an arena. On one side, she saw Richard Thompson and his family, their faces a mask of arrogance and disdain. On the other, a jury of 12 ordinary citizens who would decide the fate of this case. The judge entered, and the session was opened. The prosecutor, working in conjunction with Amanda and Jake, presented the case. The charges were serious: sexual harassment, corruption, tax fraud, among other crimes. Emily observed Richard's face, noticing how his confident expression began to falter as the evidence was presented. Then came the moment Emily both feared and longed for: her testimony. As she climbed into the witness stand, she felt all eyes in the room upon her. For an instant, fear threatened to engulf her. But then she saw Jake, his gaze conveying confidence and support. She saw Amanda determined and strong, and she saw the other women, her companions on this journey of pain and hope. With a clear and firm voice, Emily began to tell her story. She spoke about the harassment, the violence, the constant fear. But she also spoke about courage, about the strength she found in herself and in the other women who had united with her. When the defense attorney tried to discredit her with aggressive questions, Emily remained unshakable, her determination growing with each attempt at intimidation. The days dragged on, filled with emotional testimonies and shocking revelations. Former employees of the Thompson Company came forward with evidence of corruption. Politicians implicated in the scheme were exposed. With each new revelation, Emily saw the Thompsons' empire crumble a little more. But the defense didn't yield easily. They counterattacked vigorously, trying to tarnish the witnesses' reputations and question the legality of the evidence. There were moments when Emily felt the fear return, moments when she wondered if they would have the strength to win this battle. It was during one of these moments of doubt that something unexpected happened. One morning, as Emily entered the courthouse, an elderly woman approached her. "You don't know me," the lady said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I worked for the Thompsons many years ago. What Richard did to you, he did to me too. I never had the courage to speak up, to face him. But seeing you here, fighting, you gave me courage." The woman handed Emily an envelope. "Here's evidence I've kept all these years. Use it. Do justice not just for yourself, but for all of us." That encounter was a turning point. The evidence provided by the former employee was devastating, showing a pattern of abuse that extended over decades. The Thompsons' defense, already fragile, began to crumble. On the penultimate day of the trial, there was a surprising turn of events. One of the executives of the Thompson Company, pressured by the accumulated evidence, decided to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a deal. His testimony was the final straw, exposing the full extent of the corruption and abuses committed by the family. Emily watched with a mixture of shock and relief as Richard Thompson lost his composure in court, shouting accusations and threats. It was a surreal moment to see the man who had terrorized her so much reduced to a desperate and pathetic individual. Finally, after weeks of intense judicial debate, The moment for the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable in the air. Emily felt Jake's hand gently squeeze hers, offering silent support. When the judge began to read the sentence, the world seemed to be in suspension. In the case of the state against Richard Thompson and the Thompson family, this court finds the defendants. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Guilty on all charges. The room exploded in a mixture of shouts, cries, and applause. Emily felt as if a giant wave had hit her. Tears of relief and joy ran down her face as she was embraced by Amanda, Jake, and the other women who had fought by her side. Richard Thompson and his accomplices were sentenced to long prison terms. The family's company was placed under investigation, with much of its assets frozen for future reparations to the victims. As she left the courthouse that day, Emily was greeted as a heroine. Women approached to hug her, thanking her for her courage. Journalists shouted questions, eager to capture her first words after the victory. But amid all the tumult, Emily could only think of one thing. They had done it. Justice, so elusive for so long, had finally prevailed. That night, exhausted but euphoric, Emily gathered with her family, Amanda, Jake, and the other women who had become her second family throughout this journey. As they celebrated their victory, Emily felt her baby move, as if also celebrating. Looking around the room at the smiling and relieved faces, Emily felt a wave of gratitude and hope. She knew that this victory was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, many other victims who needed help, many other battles to be fought. But at that moment, surrounded by love and support, with Jake's hand in hers and the future opening up before her like a bright horizon, Emily knew she was ready for any challenge that might come her way. She had found her voice, her strength. And now she was determined to use that strength to help others do the same. The months following the victory in court were an emotional roller coaster for Emily. The case had gained national notoriety, transforming her into a symbol of resistance and hope for women across the country. Invitations for interviews, lectures, and awareness events arrived daily. Emily, still adjusting to her new reality, faced each new challenge with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She knew that her story could inspire others to speak up, to fight for justice. On a sunny Saturday morning, Emily was preparing for an important interview on a national television program when she felt the first contractions. Her baby, apparently, had decided it was time to make its entrance into the world. "Jake!" she called, a mix of panic and excitement in her voice. "I think the baby is coming." Jake, who was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, ran to the bedroom, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. "Now? But there are still 2 weeks to go," Emily laughed, despite the pain. "Looks like he or she inherited my impatience." The following hours were a whirlwind. The rush to the hospital, hurried calls to family and friends, the growing anxiety as the contractions intensified. Amanda arrived shortly after, bringing Emily's mother and sisters with her. The labor was long and difficult. Emily, exhausted and in pain, found strength in Jake's words of encouragement. He didn't leave her side for a moment. He held her hand, wiped her sweat, whispered words of love and support. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a baby's cry filled the room. "It's a girl," announced the doctor, placing the small bundle in Emily's trembling arms. Looking at her daughter's face for the first time, Emily felt a wave of love so intense it almost took her breath away. Tears of joy streamed down her face as she admired every perfect detail of the baby. "She's beautiful," Jake whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Just like her mother." Emily smiled at him, feeling her heart overflow with happiness. "What should we name her?" After a moment of reflection, Jake suggested, "How about Hope? Because that's what she represents." Hope for a better future. Emily nodded, touched. Hope. It's perfect. In the days that followed, Emily's hospital room became a meeting point. Amanda, Sophia, and the other women who had fought by her side in the case against the Thompsons came to meet little Hope, bringing gifts and words of affection. It was during one of these visits that Sophia, holding Hope in her arms, made a suggestion that would change the course of Emily's life once again. "You know, Emily," she began hesitantly, "many of us have been talking about what happened, about what you did for all of us, and we thought, What if we could help other women in the same way? Emily tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? Sophia explained the idea that the group had developed to create a non-profit organization dedicated to helping women victims of harassment and abuse, offering legal, psychological, and financial support. We'd like you to lead this, Emily, Sophia concluded. Your strength, your story. You could inspire so many others to seek justice. The proposal caught Emily by surprise. She looked at Jake, who smiled encouragingly. It's an amazing idea, he said, and I can't think of anyone better to do this than you. Emily was silent for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the proposal. It was a big responsibility, but also an opportunity to transform her painful experience into something positive, something that could help countless other women. I accept, she finally said, feeling a new wave of determination grow inside her. In the weeks and months that followed, between night feedings and diaper changes, Emily worked tirelessly to bring the new organization to life. Amanda offered her legal expertise, helping to structure the entity and ensure that all legal bases were covered. Jake, besides being a dedicated father to Hope, used his contacts in the business world to raise funds and support. Sophia and the other women became the first volunteers, bringing their own experiences and perspectives to shape the support programs. The organization, which Emily decided to call Voices of Hope, quickly gained recognition. Women from all over the country began to seek them out, some looking for help, others offering support. 1 year after Hope's birth, Emily was standing on a stage in front of an audience of hundreds of people, officially inaugurating the headquarters of Voices of Hope. Looking at the crowd, she saw faces of survivors, of supporters, of people who believed in the possibility of change. When I began this journey, Emily started her speech, her voice firm and emotional, I was alone, afraid and hopeless, but I learned that none of us need to face injustice alone. Together, our voices are stronger. Together, we can change not just our own lives, but the world around us. As she spoke, Emily saw Jake in the front row holding Hope in his arms. Her daughter, now 1-year-old, smiled and babbled, oblivious to the importance of the moment, but embodying everything her mother fought for, a better, fairer, and safer future. Emily concluded her speech with words of hope and determination. This is just the beginning. Together we will build a world where no woman has to suffer in silence, where every voice is heard and respected. A world we can proudly leave for our daughters and sons. The applause that followed was deafening. Emily stepped down from the stage to be embraced by Jake, Hope squeezed between them in a family hug full of love and promise. At that moment, looking at her family and the people gathered there, all united by a common purpose, Emily felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Her journey had been difficult, full of pain and challenges, but every step had led her to this moment. She knew that the path ahead would still be long and, at times, difficult. But now, with Hope in her arms, Jake by her side, and a community of strong women around her, Emily was ready to face any challenge. The future, once so uncertain and frightening, now shone with possibilities. And Emily was determined to make each day count, to continue fighting not just for herself, but for all women who still needed to find their voice and their strength. 5 years had passed since the inauguration of Voices of Hope. What began as a small organization in Chicago had transformed into a national network of support and advocacy for women victims of harassment and abuse. Emily, now 27 years old, looked out the window of her office, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her here. Voices of Hope had become a beacon of hope for thousands of women across the United States. With branches in several major cities, the organization offered not only legal and psychological support, but also professional training programs and safe shelters for women at risk. That sunny morning, Emily was preparing for an important meeting with federal government representatives. Years of hard work and relentless lobbying were finally bearing fruit. New legislation to strengthen penalties against harassers and offer greater protection to victims was about to be voted on in Congress. As she organized her documents, Emily heard a soft knock on the door. It was Amanda, now legal director of Voices of Hope. "Ready to change the world once again?" Amanda asked with a smile. Emily laughed. "Always, but you know we never do this alone." The two women walked together through the office corridors, greeting the dedicated team that had grown along with the organization. Emily paused briefly to observe a group of women participating in a self-defense workshop, one of the many initiatives that Voices of Hope had developed over the years. On the way to the car, Emily received a message from Jake. "Good luck at the meeting, my love. Hope and I will be rooting for you. We love you." A loving smile spread across Emily's face. Jake, now her husband, had become not only her life partner, but also a tireless ally in the fight for women's rights. He had left his old job to dedicate himself fully to Voices of Hope, leading initiatives to involve men in the cause and promote cultural changes. Little Hope, now 5 years old, was a constant source of joy and inspiration. Curious and compassionate, she already showed signs that she would follow in her parents' footsteps in the fight for a fairer world. The meeting at the Justice Department was intense but productive. Emily presented data, testimonies, and concrete proposals, her firm and passionate voice echoing through the room. She was no longer just the frightened young woman who had faced Richard Thompson in court years ago. Now she was a respected leader, whose experience and dedication had touched countless lives. At the end of the meeting, the Secretary of Justice shook Emily's hand with admiration. "Your organization has been doing remarkable work, Mrs. Walker. You can count on our support for this new legislation." Leaving the department, Emily was surprised by a group of women waiting for her. They were survivors who had been helped by Voices of Hope over the years. They carried flowers and thank you signs. A young woman approached, tears in her eyes. "Emily, I wanted to thank you personally. When I thought I had no more hope, your organization reached out to me. Today, I'm standing, strong, and ready to help other women like you helped me." Moved, Emily hugged the young woman. Moments like this reminded her of why she did this work, of the real impact they were having on people's lives. Back at the office, Emily found a surprise waiting for her. Jake and Hope had organized a small celebration with the team to commemorate the success of the meeting. Hope ran into her mother's arms. "Mommy, did you save the world today?" Emily laughed, hugging her daughter. "Not alone, my love. We're all working together to make the world a better place." Looking around the room at the smiling faces of her family and colleagues, Emily felt a wave of gratitude. Her journey had been difficult, full of obstacles and moments of doubt, but each challenge had made her stronger, more determined. That night at home, Emily sat down to write in her diary, a habit she had maintained since the tumultuous days of the trial. Reflecting on everything that had happened, she wrote, "Sometimes I still wonder how that frightened young woman who worked at the Thompson mansion transformed into the person I am today. The truth is that the transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a journey of small steps, of courageous choices, of hands extended in moments of need. I learned that true strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up every time, bringing others with you. I learned that our voices, when united, have the power to move mountains and change laws. I look at my daughter, Hope, and I see in her the future we fight for. A future where no woman will have to suffer in silence, where every voice will be heard and respected. Our fight is far from over. There is still much work to be done, many battles to be fought. But today, more than ever, I have hope. Hope for a better tomorrow, for a more just and equal world. And as long as there is this hope, we will continue fighting. Together, our voices will echo. Together we will build the future we dream of." Emily closed the diary, a feeling of peace and determination enveloping her. Tomorrow would be another day of work, another day of struggle, but with her family by her side and the strength of so many brave women supporting her, she knew she was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she was born to do. The future, once so uncertain, now shone with possibilities, and Emily was ready to embrace it with all the strength and hope in her heart. The sun had barely risen when Emily awoke, feeling strangely restless. She looked at Jake, still asleep beside her, and smiled softly. 10 years had passed since the trial that changed her life, and their love had only grown stronger with time. Silently, she got up and walked to Hope's room. Her daughter, now 9 years old, slept peacefully, her dark curls spread across the pillow. Emily felt her heart fill with love and renewed determination. It was for Hope, and for all girls like her, that she continued her fight. Going downstairs, Emily turned on the television, keeping the volume low. The morning news was focused on a topic that made her heart race: Richard Thompson's appeal trial. After years of appeals and legal maneuvers, Richard had managed to get his case re-examined. The possibility, however remote, that he could be released had left Emily and the entire Voices of Hope team on high alert for the past few weeks. The phone rang, making Emily jump. It was Amanda. "Emily, have you seen the news?" Amanda's voice was tense. "I'm watching now," Emily replied, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Any news?" Amanda sighed. "Nothing concrete yet, but our contacts at the court say Richard's defense has an ace up their sleeve. They don't know exactly what it is, but they're confident." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. After all these years, after all the progress they had made, the idea of Richard escaping justice was unbearable. "What can we do?" Emily asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "For now, we need to stay vigilant," Amanda responded. "I've gathered the legal team for an emergency meeting this morning. Can you come?" "I'll be there," Emily assured. When she hung up the phone, Emily noticed Jake standing in the kitchen doorway, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "I heard your conversation," he said softly. "We'll face this together, like we always have." Emily nodded, grateful for her husband's constant strength and support. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. At the Voices of Hope headquarters, the team worked tirelessly, reviewing documents, contacting witnesses, and preparing for any possible scenario. Meanwhile, on the streets, the news of Richard Thompson's possible appeal sparked a wave of protests. Thousands of women, many of them supported by Voices of Hope over the years, took to the streets demanding that justice be maintained. Emily watched all of this with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The movement she had helped initiate had grown beyond her wildest dreams, becoming a powerful force in American society. But with this growth came new challenges and responsibilities. In the middle of the afternoon, when tension was at its peak, Emily received an unexpected call. It was Sophia, her former colleague from the Thompson mansion. "Emily, you need to come to the hospital immediately," Sophia's voice was urgent. "It's Mrs. Johnson. She's not well." Emily's heart sank. Mrs. Johnson, the former cook at the Thompson mansion, had become a maternal figure for Emily over the years. Now elderly and frail, she was one of the few connections Emily still maintained with her past. Without hesitation, Emily rushed to the hospital. There she found Mrs. Johnson in a bed, looking small and fragile, but with eyes still bright with recognition when she saw Emily. "My girl," Mrs. Johnson whispered, extending a trembling hand. "I needed to see you." Before Emily held the old woman's hand, tears in her eyes. "I'm here, Mrs. Johnson, I'm here." With visible effort, Mrs. Johnson continued, "I have something to tell you, something I've kept all these years, about Richard and your father." Emily froze, her heart racing. "My father? But I never knew my father." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "I know, dear, and there's a reason for that. You see, years ago, before you were born, your father worked for the Thompsons. He discovered something that could have destroyed the Thompson family. But before he could do anything, he disappeared." Emily's mind was spinning with this revelation. All her life she had wondered about her father, imagining why he had abandoned her mother even before she was born. And now, after all these years, what did he discover? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Johnson closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "Documents. Evidence of crimes dating back decades. Your father, he hid this evidence to protect your mother, to protect you." With trembling hands, Mrs. Johnson handed Emily a small folded paper. "This is the place where your father hid everything. He told me shortly before. I should have spoken sooner, but I was so afraid." Emily held the paper as if it were the most precious object in the world. On it, an address was scrawled in shaky handwriting. At that moment, Emily's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Amanda. "Urgent. Richard's defense has presented new evidence. The judge is considering reopening the case." Emily's world seemed to be spinning out of control. On one side, the threat of seeing all her work crumble with Richard's possible release. On the other, the promise of answers about her past, about the father she never knew. Looking at Mrs. Johnson, who was now resting with her eyes closed, and then at the paper in her hand, Emily knew she was at a crossroads. The decisions she made in the next few hours could change everything, not just for her, but for all the women who depended on voices of hope. With a heavy heart but determined, Emily stood up. She had a choice to make, and time was running out. Emily left the hospital with her mind in turmoil. The paper with the address burned in her pocket, while Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in her ears. Her hand trembled as she picked up her cell phone to call Jake. "Jake, I need you to come pick me up at the hospital. Now," she said, her voice barely containing the urgency. 15 minutes later, Jake arrived, his face tense with concern. What happened? Emily got into the car and, without wasting time, began to tell everything Mrs. Johnson had revealed. Jake listened in silence, his eyes widening with each new piece of information. "My God, Emily," he finally said. "This changes everything." "I know," she replied, running her hand through her hair. "And now we have to decide what to do with this information." The couple discussed fervently as they drove to the address on the paper. It was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, an abandoned industrial area that seemed not to have seen activity in years. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jake asked, parking the car. "We could call the police or—" Emily shook her head. "No. We need to see what's there first. If it's really what Mrs. Johnson said—" Together they entered the dusty warehouse. The place was dark and full of menacing shadows. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, reminding her of the days when she lived in constant fear at the Thompson mansion. After minutes that seemed like hours, rummaging through old boxes and rusty machinery, Jake shouted, "Emily!" "Here?" He had found a small safe embedded in the wall, hidden behind a dusty shelf. Emily's heart raced. With trembling hands, she typed in her birth date, the only thing her mother always said her father had left for her. To her surprise and relief, the safe opened with a soft click. Inside was a thick folder full of documents, photos, and what appeared to be a diary. Emily picked up the diary reverently, immediately recognizing her father's handwriting from the few letters her mother had kept. "Come on, it's not safe to stay here," Jake said, looking nervously around. Back in the car, Emily began to leaf through the documents, her heart beating faster and faster as she understood what she was seeing. "Jake," she whispered, "this is much bigger than we imagined. It's not just about Richard or the Thompsons. There are politicians, judges, businessmen. It's an entire network of corruption and abuse of power." Jake nodded gravely. "And that's why your father disappeared." The implications of what they had discovered were overwhelming. Emily knew they had in their hands something that could not only ensure that Richard remained in prison, but also expose an entire system of corruption that had allowed people like him to go unpunished for so long. But she also knew that revealing this information would be dangerous. Very dangerous. "What are we going to do?" Jake asked softly. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about everything she had been through, about all the women who had trusted her, about her daughter Hope and the future she wanted to build for her. "We're going to do the right thing," she finally said, her voice firm. "We're going to expose everything." The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Emily and Jake called an emergency meeting with Amanda and the legal team of Voices of Hope. Together they spent the entire night analyzing the documents, verifying information, and preparing a strategy. The next morning, as the court prepared to hear the new arguments from Richard's defense, Emily entered the judge's chambers, accompanied by Amanda and Jake. "Your Honor," Amanda began, "we have new evidence that not only confirms Richard Thompson's guilt, but also exposes a much wider network of corruption." The judge, surprised, listened attentively as Amanda presented the documents. From across the room, Emily saw Richard's face pale, fear replacing his usual arrogance. The hours that followed were intense. The judge, after examining the evidence, ordered an immediate investigation. Richard, seeing his plan crumble, tried to flee, only to be detained at the courthouse exit. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the case was on every newscast. Politicians were arrested, judges removed, companies investigated. It was as if a house of cards was collapsing, and Emily was at the center of it all. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Emily testified at countless hearings, provided evidence for dozens of investigations. Voices of Hope became a beacon of change, not just for abuse victims, but for anyone seeking justice in a corrupted system. Amidst all the chaos, Emily finally found time to read her father's diary. Through his words, she got to know the man who had sacrificed everything to protect her, who had fought against the same system she was now bringing down. One afternoon, months after the initial discovery, Emily was in her office when she received an unexpected visit. It was an elderly woman with gentle eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Emily," the woman said softly, "I'm your paternal grandmother. Your father, my son, he would be so proud of you." The tears Emily had held back for so long finally fell. Embracing her newly discovered grandmother, she felt as if a circle was closing, as if all the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. That night at home with Jake and Hope, Emily reflected on her journey. From a frightened young woman working at the Thompson mansion to a leader of a movement that was changing the country. She had faced her fears, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and in the process had not only found her own voice, but had helped countless others find theirs. Looking at her daughter playing carefree on the living room rug, Emily smiled. The world Hope would inherit wouldn't be perfect, but it would be better, fairer, more hopeful. And that, Emily thought, was the most important legacy she could leave. 5 years passed since the revelation that shook the power structures in the United States. Emily, now 37 years old, observed the city of Chicago from the window of her office at the Voices of Hope headquarters. The organization had grown exponentially, becoming one of the most respected and influential NGOs in the country. The phone rang, pulling Emily from her thoughts. It was Amanda, now Secretary of Justice, a position she assumed after the great cleansing in the judicial system. "Emily, we have good news," Amanda said, her voice overflowing with enthusiasm. "The bill we've been working on has been approved. From now on, we'll have specialized courts for harassment and abuse cases across the country." Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was a victory they had been fighting for years. "That's incredible, Amanda. I can't believe we finally did it." "It's thanks to you, Emily," Amanda replied. "Your courage opened the doors for all these changes." After hanging up, Emily allowed herself a moment of reflection. The path to this point had been long and difficult, but every obstacle overcome, every battle won, had been worth it. Her phone vibrated with a message from Jake. "Don't forget, we have Hope's recital tonight. Love you." Emily smiled. Even with all her responsibilities, she never missed an important event in her daughter's life. Hope, now 14 years old, was a brilliant and compassionate teenager, already showing signs that she would follow in her parents' footsteps in the fight for social justice. Before leaving the office, Emily passed by the meeting room, where a group of young women was participating in a leadership training. She paused for a moment to observe them, feeling a mixture of pride and hope. These were the leaders of the future, women who grew up seeing that change was possible, that their voices mattered. On the way to Hope's recital, Emily made a stop at the cemetery. It was a visit she made regularly, a moment of connection with her past and a reminder of why she continued fighting. In front of her father's grave, Emily placed a bouquet of flowers. "Dad," she said softly, "I hope you're proud. We're continuing your work, and we're making a difference." Next to it was another recent grave, that of Mrs. Johnson, who had passed away a few months after revealing the truth about Emily's father. "Thank you," Emily whispered, gently touching the tombstone. "For your courage, for your kindness, we'll never forget." Arriving at the school auditorium, Emily found Jake saving seats. They exchanged a quick kiss before sitting down. The recital began, and Emily felt her heart swell with pride as she saw Hope take the stage. Her daughter, so young and yet so strong, was a constant reminder of why all the sacrifice had been worth it. After the recital, as the family celebrated at a nearby restaurant, Emily's cell phone rang again. It was Sophia, now director of one of the Voices of Hope branches. "Emily, you won't believe it," Sophia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Remember that girl we helped last month? She just won a full scholarship. She said she was inspired by your story to pursue law and help other women." Emily felt tears in her eyes. It was for moments like this that she continued, even when the path seemed too difficult. Back home, late at night, Emily sat in her personal office. The walls were covered with photos and newspaper clippings, a mural of her journey. There were images from Richard's trial, the founding of Voices of Hope, demonstrations and legislative victories. Her eyes landed on one particular photo, her, pregnant, next to Jake, on the day they decided to create the organization. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Emily picked up her diary, a habit she had maintained since the tumultuous days at the Thompson mansion. Flipping through the pages, she saw her own evolution, from a frightened young woman to a confident leader. Reaching the last blank page, Emily began to write, "Dear Hope, when you were born, I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to create a better world for you. A world where you would never have to go through what I went through, where your voice would always be heard and respected. Looking back, I see that this promise wasn't just for you, but for all the girls and women who would come after us. Every battle we fought, every obstacle we overcame was a step towards that future. Today I see you growing strong and brave, and I feel that somehow we've succeeded. It's not a perfect world. There's still much work to be done. But it's a world of possibilities, a world where change is not just a dream, but a reality we build every day. My dear daughter, as you read this, I want you to know your voice matters, your story matters, and you have the power to make a difference, just like each one of us. Keep fighting, keep dreaming, keep believing. The future is yours to shape. With all my love, Mom." Emily closed the diary, feeling a deep peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, in this moment, she knew she was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she was born to do. The future, once so uncertain and frightening, now shone with possibilities, and Emily was ready to embrace it, with all the strength and hope in her heart. The auditorium was packed. A sea of expectant faces turned towards the stage. Emily took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone clipped to her blouse. At 42 years old, she was about to give the most important speech of her life. "Welcome to the 15th anniversary celebration of Voices of Hope," she began, her voice firm and warm echoing through the hall. "When we started this journey, we were just a small group of women, united by a common cause. Today I look at all of you and see a movement that has transformed America." The words flowed easily as Emily recalled the milestones of the past years, the laws passed, the thousands of women helped, the cultural changes they had witnessed. But more than numbers and statistics, she spoke of stories of courage, of overcoming, of hope. In the front row, Jake smiled proudly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Beside him, Hope, now a young woman of 19, listened attentively, taking notes. Recently enrolled in law school, Hope was already a respected activist in her own right. "But our fight is far from over," Emily continued, her voice gaining intensity. "There are still women suffering in silence. There are still injustices to be corrected. Our mission continues, more important than ever." As she spoke, Emily couldn't help but reflect on her own journey. From the frightened young woman working at the Thompson mansion to the confident leader she was today, each step had been a lesson, each obstacle an opportunity for growth. "The true power of change," she said, looking directly at the camera broadcasting the event live across the country, "is in each of us. It's in the courage to stand up against injustice, in the compassion to reach out to those in need, in the determination to never give up, no matter how difficult the path." Emily's words reverberated through the room, touching hearts and minds. Among the audience, familiar faces stood out. Amanda, now a respected figure in national politics, Sophia, leading her own NGO, and many other women whose lives had been transformed by Voices of Hope. "Today, we celebrate not just our organization," Emily continued, her voice laden with emotion. "We celebrate every woman who found her voice, every survivor who became a warrior, every ally who joined our cause. We celebrate a future where our daughters and granddaughters can live without fear, where their voices are heard and respected." As Emily spoke, images were projected behind her. Photographs from the organization's early days, videos of demonstrations and judicial victories, smiling faces of women who had rebuilt their lives. "And to you young people watching us," Emily said, looking directly at a group of students at the back of the auditorium, "I want to say, the future is in your hands. You have the power to continue this fight, to carry our mission forward. Believe in yourselves, raise your voices, be the change you want to see in the world." Emily paused, her eyes scanning the room. She saw hope, determination, and above all, a palpable sense of unity. Together, we can create a world where equality is not just a dream, but a lived reality. A world where every voice matters, where every story is heard. This is the legacy we want to leave, the future we are building one step at a time. Her final words were met with a standing ovation. As the applause thundered through the auditorium, Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This moment, this triumph, wasn't just hers. It belonged to all who had believed, who had fought, who had refused to be silenced. After the speech, as she greeted supporters and received emotional hugs, Emily was surprised by a young reporter. "Mrs. Walker," the reporter asked, "after all you've achieved, what's your next goal?" Emily smiled, thoughtful. "My next goal? It's to ensure that we no longer need organizations like Voices of Hope, that we live in a world where equality and respect are the norm, not the exception." Later that night at home with Jake and Hope, Emily reflected on the day. Hope was excitedly sharing her ideas for a new project at college, a legal clinic to help women in vulnerable situations. "You know, Mum," Hope said, her eyes shining with the same fire that Emily recognized in herself, "sometimes I wonder how you found the courage to start all of this." Emily smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Courage, my love, comes when we realize that our voice is stronger than our fear, and that we're never really alone in the fight for justice." Jake joined the hug, and for a moment, Emily allowed herself to simply feel the love of her family, the pride in what they had accomplished, the hope for what was yet to come. Later, alone in her office, Emily opened her old diary. On the last blank pages, she began to write, "Dear future, today, looking back, I see a journey that began with fear and ended with hope. I see a frightened girl who became a strong woman, a whisper that turned into a battle cry. But more importantly, I see a bright future ahead of us, a future built on the foundations of courage, compassion, and perseverance. A future where every voice is heard, where every story matters. To those who will come after us, always remember that change begins with a single voice, that the power to transform the world resides in each of us. Keep fighting, keep believing, keep hoping. The future is yours to shape, to dream, to realize. And always remember, you are never alone. Your voices, united, can move mountains. With love and eternal hope, Emily." Closing the diary, Emily looked out the window at the illuminated city. The path ahead was still long, but she knew she didn't walk alone. With each life touched, each voice amplified, the future became a little brighter. And so, with her heart full of hope and renewed determination, Emily prepared for the next chapter of her journey. Not just her personal journey, but the collective journey of all voices that refused to be silenced. The future was calling, and she was ready to answer.